France controls more ocean than China, more than Russia, more than Australia. Surprised? That's because almost every map you've ever seen is lying by omission. Clipperton is one of the smallest French territories. There are dozens of others. And together, those forgotten islands turned France into the world's second-largest maritime empire. On any standard world map, France looks like a medium-sized country in Western Europe, a hexagon squeezed between Spain, Germany, and the Alps, with a coastline facing both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. 68 million people. A recognizable silhouette. The kind of country whose shape school children draw from memory. That map is accurate. It's also incomplete. France controls the second-largest exclusive economic zone on Earth. Larger than China's, larger than Australia's, larger than Russia's, second only to the United States, which holds that position for nearly identical structural reasons. France's total maritime jurisdiction covers 11 million square kilometers of ocean, an area roughly equal to the combined landmass of the United States, Russia, and Canada. A country roughly the size of Texas controls more ocean than almost any power in recorded history. The scale is genuinely hard to process. The question is how this happened, and why France still has it when every other major European colonial empire has been substantially dismantled. After World War II, Europe's colonial empires began to disappear. Britain left India. The Dutch lost Indonesia. Belgium left the Congo. Portugal eventually lost its African colonies. France seemed to be following the same path. Morocco and Tunisia became independent. Algeria followed after a devastating war. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were gone. Then, in 1960 alone, 17 French African colonies became independent. It looked like the French Empire was over, except it wasn't. Some territories made a completely different choice. Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, Réunion. Instead of becoming independent, they voted to become full parts of France. Not territories, not protectorates. France itself. A child born in Martinique would carry the same passport, vote in the same presidential elections, and have the same legal rights as someone born in Paris. Why would anyone choose to stay inside what looked like a collapsing empire? The answer is far more complicated than most people think. I spent time going through those records, and one pattern kept appearing. The communities that voted most strongly for integration were, in many cases, the ones most economically dependent on metropolitan France. Independence in 1958 meant sovereignty, but it also meant losing French capital investment, French market access, French welfare infrastructure, French legal frameworks. For small islands with limited agricultural land and no industrial base, that wasn't a clean trade. It was a calculation about which risks were manageable. Several neighboring islands chose independence and spent the following decades economically isolated in ways that shaped how populations in the French territories viewed the choice. Not everyone made the same decision. French Polynesia retained a more autonomous status. New Caledonia, whose indigenous Kanak population had a very different historical relationship with French settlement, became an ongoing negotiation rather than a settled question. But here's the strange part. France still didn't know those islands would become incredibly valuable. But most of the territories that stayed French stayed voluntarily, legally, constitutionally, and they were still French in 1982. That's when everything changed. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted in 1982 and entered into force in 1994. It established something that had never existed in international law with such clarity before. Every coastal state, every island, every atoll, every inhabited rock could now claim an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles in every direction. Within that zone, the coastal state held sovereign rights over all natural resources, fish populations, oil and gas deposits, mineral concentrations on the seabed. Before UNCLOS, those resources existed in legal uncertainty. Ships from any nation could sail into open ocean and extract what they found. After UNCLOS, they belonged to someone. Over the decade it took for the convention to be fully ratified and applied, France's scattered territories stopped being administrative curiosities with colonial histories and became something else: legally established resource zones with enforceable exclusive rights, distributed across every ocean basin on the planet. The Pacific Ocean alone contains vast deposits of polymetallic nodules, concentrations of manganese, cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earth elements sitting on the seafloor at depths of 4 to 6 kilometers. The commercial technology to extract them at scale doesn't fully exist yet, but France's legal claim to the zones where they accumulate does exist and has been active since the mid-1990s. That should have been the end of a fairly clean story. France kept its islands. International law caught up. The islands generated jurisdiction. France got jurisdiction over resources it didn't know it was sitting on. Overnight, tiny islands that nobody cared about suddenly generated millions of square kilometers of ocean. It wasn't. France's EEZ isn't just large. It's strategically distributed in a way that no other European power comes close to matching. French territories don't cluster in one ocean. They're spread across 5. French Polynesia anchors France in the South Pacific, New Caledonia in the Southwest Pacific, Réunion and Mayotte in the Indian Ocean. The scattered islands off Madagascar, Kerguelen and the Crozet Islands near Antarctica, the French Antilles in the Caribbean, French Guiana, which is South American soil and houses the Kourou launch site for European space missions, Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon just off the coast of Newfoundland. Each piece is small on its own map. Put them together and France is the only country whose maritime jurisdiction reaches every ocean basin simultaneously. This gives France something that cannot be purchased after the fact and is almost impossible to replicate. Military bases in Polynesia, in Réunion, in Djibouti, in Martinique aren't just protecting French citizens, they're access points in a world where physical presence still determines what is and isn't possible. Port access, maritime surveillance, the ability to project naval force at distance without the months of preparation other European militaries would require. France's position rarely comes up in standard discussions of which countries actually have global reach. The EEZ and the territories that generate it aren't part of how France presents itself internationally. They don't figure prominently in French domestic politics most years. But in any serious assessment of which nations hold strategic options in the coming decades, the ability to act, to access, to contest, France's island network looks less like a colonial remnant being tolerated for sentimental reasons and more like a quietly maintained infrastructure that no other European country comes anywhere near possessing. That's not a coincidence. It's the product of choices made in the 1940s and 1950s by populations who had no way of knowing what the ocean floor would come to be worth, and no way of knowing that 1982 would draw a legal line turning scattered coral and volcanic rock into enforceable maritime jurisdiction. But this global empire has one problem, one island that could change everything: New Caledonia, an archipelago of roughly 300,000 people in the Southwest Pacific, 1,200 miles east of Australia. It also contains an estimated 22% of the world's known nickel reserves, nickel that is essential for electric vehicle batteries, for stainless steel production, for the supply chains driving the energy transition that every major economy is now racing to manage. The Kanak people, indigenous Melanesians whose ancestors arrived in New Caledonia thousands of years before France claimed the island in 1853, have never settled quietly into this arrangement. A violent independence movement emerged in the 1980s. The 1988 Uvea hostage crisis, a siege, a military assault, 19 dead, forced a renegotiation of the territory's political structure. The Noumea Accord of 1998 transferred certain powers to local authorities and scheduled 3 referendums on independence. 3 referendums took place. 2018, 56% voted to remain French. 2020, 53%. 2021, 97% voted to remain. But the major pro-independence parties boycotted that vote, citing COVID restrictions that had prevented Kanak communities from completing traditional mourning ceremonies for their dead, which under Kanak custom preclude participation in major public events. The result was legally valid. Politically, it settled nothing. In 2024, months of riots, buildings burned, 13 people died, France deployed security forces. The talks resumed, then stalled. Here's the take that will draw some disagreement. France's legal framework in New Caledonia is genuinely constitutional. The referendums were genuinely held under international observation, but a series of close-margin votes on whether to remain inside one of the world's most generous welfare states does not resolve the underlying question of who benefits from the resource wealth that sits beneath those islands. France has invested genuinely in New Caledonia: hospitals, schools, infrastructure, welfare transfers. That's real. It's also real that the economic benefits of nickel extraction have flowed primarily to French-owned companies and to metropolitan France, while Kanak unemployment and poverty rates remain among the highest in the territory. Both things are simultaneously true. Anyone handing you a simple version of this story is leaving something important out. What do you think? When resource wealth and democratic legitimacy point in different directions, which one should take precedence? It's the question New Caledonia has been unable to answer for 40 years. Comment your answer. We read them. If you want to understand how geography generates power that outlasts empires, how the accidents of history and the decisions of small populations in the 1950s ended up shaping the strategic map of the 21st century, subscribe. That's what Mapped exists to work through. In 2022, a French parliamentary delegation flew to Clipperton Island. They stayed a few hours. They conducted some research. They filed a report back in Paris. They were, in the most practical sense, maintaining a claim. Not primarily for the fishing rights. The tuna are not the main point. The point is the legal jurisdiction that the island generates, radiating outward for 200 nautical miles, covering portions of the Pacific floor that are increasingly understood to contain the raw materials of the next industrial economy. The nodules on the seafloor are worth nothing until the technology to extract them makes them worth something. That technology is arriving now. France is already there, legally, militarily, constitutionally, by decisions made before anyone knew there was anything worth claiming. The standard map of France shows a country in Europe: the Seine, the Alps, the cathedral cities, the wine regions. That map isn't wrong. It shows one layer of a picture that has several. The other layer is drawn in water, 11 million square kilometers of it, scattered across every ocean, maintained by patrol frigates, parliamentary delegations, and the inherited weight of mid-20th century choices made by island populations who were calculating their material futures, not drawing maritime boundaries. The legal frameworks for deep-sea mining are still being written. The communities living inside those zones are still waiting to understand whether the wealth beneath them will change their circumstances or simply move past them towards someone else's balance sheet. France is already there. Whether being there turns out to matter, and who it ends up mattering for, those answers are still being written. On paper, it's just a line. In reality, it decides who owns the oceans of the future.